Operation Gladio was a Cold War era NATO program that set up secret stay behind armies across Europe. Now, it was originally intended, of course, to resist the Soviet invasion of these countries, but evidence later suggested, documents released a few decades ago, that these units carried out false flag attacks, political manipulation, basically terrorist attacks as false flag attacks, raising serious questions about Western covert operations. But this has largely been kept in the dark. But somebody who's been on top of this story, been exposing the lengths that Operation Gladio went, is Colonel Roxine Towner-Watkins. She's a retired U.S. Air Force officer, spent 30 years in military service, including time at the U.S. Central Command at the Pentagon. And she brings firsthand knowledge and insight into these intelligence operations because she's worked in so many areas of the Pentagon and the U.S. military, sort of putting all of these pieces together about Operation Gladio. And Colonel Roxine Watkins joins us now. Colonel, great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
No, it's my pleasure to have you. And I have to admit, I'll plead ignorance on this up until just a few years ago, what Operation Gladio was all about. Wait a minute. NATO had stay-behind armies all across Europe after World War II, in many ways carrying out terrorist false flag events in order to rally the public support against the Soviets. I said, no, this can't be true. And sure enough, the documents reveal that. How did you start to want to educate all of us about Operation Gladio? When did you first stumble across these pieces in your research?
About 2.5 years ago. And I say that having been educated throughout my 30 years career in professional military education, to include a master's degree from Air War College. And I was devastated to think that this type of information is not widely taught, because not only does Operation Gladio involve NATO operations outside of Europe to include inside of Europe, but it is so large that it's really difficult to get your head around the entire operation.
It is massive. And whether you're talking about an attack in Bologna, Italy, or other attacks that involve individuals who are carrying out bomb attacks, the slaughter of individuals, it's massive. So maybe you can just sort of lay the groundwork for our audience if they're uninitiated to this. Again, I have to plead ignorance. Just a few short years ago, I'd never heard of this before. Some people are well versed in this, but what is Operation Gladio at its heart? Who put it in place? What years are we talking about? And what are the tentacles that reach into different parts of the U.S. military?
So if I could step back in time prior to World War II, I've read now over 100 books that deal specifically with Operation Gladio. I had prior to this research project about 600 books in my library. All of them are nonfiction, military general biographies, State Department. So I had a very wide knowledge base. And I stumbled across a couple of books, a trilogy by Anthony Sutton, which talked about the same group of oligarchs and bankers that funded the Bolshevik Revolution, Hitler's rise to power, and FDR's campaign, which, again, I'd never learned in any of my education. And I felt that was fairly intriguing. And one of the reference in the footnotes was a book called The Third Way. And Joseph Farrell talks about this manipulation of mass people to believe that there's, and I'm going to use their terminology, a left and a right. And the Bolshevik Revolution gave us the left, i.e. communism, and Hitler gave us the right. And those two power structures have been used to create a third way, which kind of pushed people all over the world into the proverbial cattle cars to their own slaughter. And I found this theory fascinating. Well, in Joseph Farrell's book, he mentioned stay-behinds, and he did it in a military context, which, again, as a career military officer, I found fascinating because I'd never even heard the term. And so I began just doing searches on the internet about stay-behinds. I was dumbfounded at how much has been written about them by different authors. And so over the course of the last 2.5 years, kind of, if I could put it all in a nutshell so everyone's brain can wrap their head around it, what you had prior to World War II was a power structure of oligarchical companies that had their own built-in paramilitary and intelligence functions. We knew them as like the British East and West Indies and the Dutch East and West Indies, but they went around the world colonizing countries using their own intelligence and paramilitary. But after World War II, the entire globe put those functions in governments. So you have this intelligence apparatus that was set up after World War II. We created the CIA, West Germany created the BND, Korea set up the KCIA, and they're all across the globe. They were all trained and coordinated to operate together. And there's lots of names, but obviously Alan Dulles' name comes up often in this network. And on the military side, basically the same thing happened. So these oligarchs has outsourced something off their balance sheet to the taxpayers around the world. What you find today is through the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of that capability has been outsourced. For example, the CIA has lots of independent intelligence fronts doing this work. And the military has outsourced a lot of their functionality to contractors like Halliburton and Blackwater and its current state. So you have, if you start now tracing those outsourced entities back, you find the same oligarchs. So not only did they off book all of their operations to us taxpayers, we're still footing the dime, but they're getting rich off of these contracted out sources. And yes, exactly. Once you get your head wrapped around that, so they're profiting off of the overthrows of governments. And they're doing that to take the resources that they took as colonial powers while making it look like they're saving the world from this boogeyman called communism or this boogeyman called Hitler or whatever. And that was the hardest part for me to kind of wrap my head around. But that is what we're looking at.
So just so I can understand, and just so I understand exactly, the idea is the governments were offloading these operations to these stay behind armies that were really third party defense, contractors, Blackwater, etc., to basically rape and pillage the land, steal resources, but they get to do it under a sort of a third party NGO rather than direct U.S. military. But this is still in existence today. I mean, we can see it in Somalia. We can see it in Syria. We're there protecting Syria's oil fields, right? We're there to protect the Syrian people and their oil from themselves, right? So this is still happening today, right?
It is still happening today. And so now that you have that picture in your mind, it's important to understand kind of their mantra is create chaos so they can control. And my wonderful husband, who puts up with me doing all of this research, because I spend about 12 hours a day doing it, came in one day and he said, "Hey, do you remember that TV show we used to watch called Get Smart?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, do you remember what the name of the two organizations were?" And I said, "No." And he said it was called Chaos and Control. And I looked at him and I went, "Oh my God." Because that is exactly what they do. They go in and create chaos with these stay behind units, which I call terrorist organizations, and just as you did. And it is done to control the people in that particular area so that these oligarch vultures can come in and monopolize the resources. So going back to the beginning, there was a secret meeting that most people have never even heard of called Operation Sunrise. It was conducted before the World War II was even over. And the main players on the US side was Allen Dulles and a man by the name of Major General Lyman Lemetsker. And I like to tell this story. I like to tell
Please.
the Operation Gladio story through the use of people, because the same people keep coming up over and over again.
Please, can you, for our audience, if they're not familiar with Allen Dulles, can maybe you just briefly explain who he is?
So Allen Dulles is one of the elites from the Northeast. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was Eisenhower's chief of staff. Allen Dulles, or Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was the CIA director. They worked for a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell's famous clients were many of these oligarchs that I'm talking about. Sullivan and Cromwell was instrumental in the United States taking over the rest of the building of the Panama Canal from France. There was some sleight of hands because we were actually in the middle of building a Nicaraguan canal, and this French company went bankrupt that was actually had the charter to build the Panama Canal. And through some sleight of hands, John Foster Dulles, on behalf of Sullivan and Cromwell, was deployed to Paris to kind of take up that mantra. He did some really, it's a long story, but it ended up with the United States taking over the rest of the building of the Panama Canal. And most people don't even know that it started off as a French project. And they used French colonial slaves from Africa to do the work for the first 40% of the Panama Canal. And Allen Dulles also worked at this same law firm. So they represent the interests of these oligarchs. Now think about that for a second. In Eisenhower's administration, you have one of the premier lawyers as your Secretary of State for these oligarchs, and the other guy is sitting as the CIA director. Do you think they're working on behalf of the United States? No, they're working on behalf of their clients, which is not the United States. It is these oligarchs. And you find that time and time again between the CIA and the Secretary of State. You have, I think it's like 9, either number 2 or number 1 at the Secretary of State that are from the Skull and Bones Secret Society at Yale. They go to Groton, a grooming school. They go to Yale. Then they end up at Harvard Law. And then they go into the government. They don't work for us. They work for these oligarchs.
The same Skull and Bones, of course, that George W. Bush was a part of, John Kerry was a part of, this secret society.
And where did John Kerry end up? At the Secretary of State. Where did George H.W. Bush end up? At the CIA.
Right. And George W. Bush, who was also a member, president of the United States. So
it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself.
So how widespread then would you say were Gladio's stay-behind networks across NATO, like in NATO countries? And how involved was the U.S. in their coordination? So we think of NATO after World War II, all across Europe, these armies sort of set up and structured. How involved was the U.S. in this disbursement, and how widespread was it? What, are we talking thousands of people?
You're talking tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So let me go back to Operation Sunrise, because it's critical people understand why we ratline Nazis out of Germany. It wasn't just because of Operation Paperclip. They went all over the world, not just to the United States. This meeting with Allen Dulles and Lyman Lemetsker was with a particular Nazi general by the last name of Wolf. That's important because stay-behind units originally were called werewolf units in Germany under Hitler. In Turkey today, they're called gray wolf units. That is another common denominator. So these werewolf units, as Hitler pushed into the Soviet Union, they were set up in Ukraine, which we still see today, because the Ukrainian Nazi symbolism is directly related back to Bandera and Lebed and several other Nazis that were personally trained by Otto Skorzeny, who worked for both Reinhard Gehlen and General Wolf. So the seeds of what we're seeing in Ukraine today were bore out of these stay behind units. So this sunrise was so important that basically Wolf bought his Gehlen and Otto Skorzeny's freedom out of the either not being prosecuted at Nuremberg because Wolf and Gehlen was not. Otto Skorzeny was stood trial, but he was found not guilty. Now, this is a guy who trained all of these stay behind werewolf units in Nazi Germany. So in the aftermath of that, they flew Reinhard Gehlen, and keep in mind, he becomes the denazified West Germany's Alan Dulles counterpart at what they call the B&D. So he is in charge of their spy organization, and Alan Dulles becomes in charge of the CIA. And they both orchestrated the spreading of the stay behind units all over the world. I found them in Iran when we overthrew Mossadegh in 1953. They were in Guatemala when we overthrew that government the year after. Operation Condor is kind of the kissing cousin of Gladio in Latin America. They were scattered throughout all of Latin America. They're all over Africa. They were all over Asia.
Who are these people, though? Are they American soldiers? They were who exactly are the people that were scattered in all of these disparate places?
So the concept was to take normal everyday citizens in a country, and I'll specifically talk about Italy because, as you mentioned, in 1990, Italy was the only one that did an in-depth investigation. And that's the reason why this entire network is now referred to as Operation Gladio, because every country called it something else. Like in Portugal, they called it Agenter Press. And I mentioned Turkey, they called it Grey Wolves. The French version was OAS. So they all have different names, but they've now all generically been called Operation Gladio because Italy was the only one that did an in-depth investigation. And in Italy, what they did to recruit these people is they went into towns and they were all like 15 people. And they were given caches of weapons to include rifles, C4 explosives, communication equipment, and money. And they were buried in normally a wooded area so that when they got the call, they could fall in on this cache of weapons and do whatever the mission was. And as you said, all of the missions, not the majority, all of the missions were domestic terrorism. And the only two people that the SDECE, which was the organization in Italy, just call it their central intelligence, their version of the CIA. The only two people of those 15 member units that they knew was the leader and the assistant leader. They didn't know any of the names of the other citizens. And that's why they called them werewolf units. They were citizens by day and killers by night. And there were thousands of these units all over Italy. And this same thing, as a matter of fact, William Colby, a future CIA director, set them up in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. You know, Sweden, the neutral country. They were everywhere.
So they were given money. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand the motivation of these people in the same way that we see today when you have these like Bernie Sanders rallies and the, whatever Patriot rallies they had, back in this early part of the summer. And we know that through sort of George Soros funded groups, they were given hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. Any of these protesters that want to come out and be agitators, they're paid. We know
Correct.
this from TikTok influencers and others. So what's the motivation? Is it really just at the heart money, or were they somehow patriots in a way that we just didn't understand?
I don't know. A lot of people have been, and I can draw the analogy back then. There were a lot of people that were genuinely scared about the communists. I certainly was. I mean, I went through the drills of, getting under my desk when I was a little kid. We were all taught that the communists any day was going to come across the Volga Gap in Europe and annihilate everybody. But if you think back to 1948, the Soviet Union's had over 50 million people killed. Most of their industrial base had been destroyed. And the thought that there was a communist threat at the time is literally ridiculous. Not to say that communism is good or anything else. And yes, there was later on a Soviet threat, but not at the time this entire operation was being set up. And so you go into a community who had just been ruled by Mussolini, a fascist dictator, for decades, and you tell them that there is this new boogeyman in town, and he's much worse than Mussolini. They're atheists. They're going to destroy the Catholic Church, which of course is sacred in Italy. So it wouldn't be hard to find people who are patriots to volunteer to protect their town from this imminent threat. But right. Again, that was never the intended purpose. And it's not unlike the brainwashing that is going on with the propaganda in the United States right now, calling Trump a fascist. It is literally the same playbook. And they did this in country after country after country. And generally in every one of those countries, there was some resource that they wanted. Indonesia, we went into Indonesia. We tried to coup the government of Sukarno and failed. Then we regrouped and overthrew that government a few years later, because there were two resources there that both the Rockefeller family and the Dutch Royal Petroleum knew was there, that they had never told the Indonesian people was there. There was a literal mountain full of gold, the purest gold they had ever found, and an untapped oil reserve that they kept secret. And in both of those cases, after they overthrew the government of Sukarno and installed their puppet government of Suharto, the Rockefellers and the Dutch oil went in there and basically, again, it's a long story, but they basically stole a lot of that by saying, oh, it's not that pure, either the oil or the gold, and lied on what they were emitting back as the royalties to the Indonesian people. And that's after they killed 1 million of them in the coup.
So all of these instances where Operation Gladio was set up, it's because of some sort of a resource, a mineral resource or something in that country. And they used communism as the boogeyman. Soviets are going to invade Indonesia. They're going to take over this territory. They're going to come to Sukarno. They're going to take over this territory. They're coming to Italy next. And so we need to have these armies created, sort of a militia, if you will, I guess.
Correct.
What was their mission then? So in the case of Italy, I mentioned Bologna. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of these terrorist activities that created these false flag events.
Well, originally, their first operation in Italy was in 1948, and it was the election. There were two people running that were kind of the odds-on favorite of being the prime minister, and one of them was very pro-NATO. Oh my God, we got to get a NATO. One of them, again, because of Mussolini, did not want to have anything to do with NATO. They wanted their country back. And of course, that person is labeled a communist sympathizer. And the CIA used $10 million in 1948, $10 million to influence that election to ensure the pro-NATO guy got involved. That was their first official interference in elections. It wasn't their last, but it was their first. And that's the entire time that we've been talking about election interference. To me, it has been blatantly obvious, both with the 2016 election and the 2020 election, that the CIA is behind both of them. If you look at where Gina Haspel was as the London CIA station chief with the creation of the Steele dossier, they are still intimately involved in election interference all around the world.
So would you say Operation Gladio is still alive and well today, just under a different name?
100%. That's why I think it's critical that people understand not only it and how it functioned early on with, and let's go back to Lyman Lemonsker, because with the JFK files, you don't hear anyone talking about this. But now that you understand the massive scope of Operation Gladio, Lyman Lemonsker was General Eisenhower in Europe's chief of logistics. What's that mean? Logistics in the military means that's the guy that's critical to get supplies where they're needed. So who would have been getting all of the weapons in Europe that now that the war's over, to these caches of weapons for Operation Gladio? It would have been General Lyman Lemonsker. That's why he's at this meeting, in order to not only understand where all of the caches are that the Nazis set up, but they're planning to put them all over Europe. So he's the logistics guy. And he's the guy that goes with Alan Dulles to this meeting? Well, of course he is. Now, where's the next time that we come to Lyman Lemonsker? Well, he ends up becoming a 4-star general, and he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when JFK gets into office. Lyman Lemonsker knows all about Operation Gladio. He's the author of Operations Northwood. Do you know what that is?
I do, but can you educate our audience on this?
Operation Northwood was a document that is declassified, several pages. And what it does is it is a laundry list of terrorist operations to be conducted inside the United States, killing American citizens and blaming Castro. It articulates that we're going to dress Cuban exiles that are basically our Gladio element in the United States, and was for decades. Brigade 2506. Felix Rodriguez, the guy that Tucker interviewed about 6 months ago, he's an assassin. He was part of Brigade 2506. If you go back and look at that interview, he's wearing the t-shirt, literally. And he was in El Salvador, he was in Nicaragua, he was in Guatemala, he was in Vietnam during the Phoenix program. He is one of them. So this Operation Northwood was to take some of the CIA-trained Cuban exiles in Miami, dress them up in Castro uniforms, have them go do bombings, just like we were talking about in Italy, killing people, blaming Castro, and then justifying a full-scale military invasion of Cuba in order to overthrow Castro. That's what Operation Northwood was. He briefed it to Robert McNamara, the SecDef, and Robert McNamara didn't find anything wrong with it. He says, hey, let's go brief this to JFK. When JFK read Operation Gladio, he's like, are you out of your mind? We're not going to kill Americans for any reason. So he fired General Lemonsker. Unfortunately, and this clearly indicates to me that JFK did not know the extent of Operation Gladio and this Hydra that had been set up. He had just survived the Bay of Pigs and didn't want any more military pissed off at him. So he didn't fire him and make him retire. He reassigned him out of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And do you know where they put him?
No.
He became the commander of NATO. And do you know that the French OAS that were trained by Operation Gladio trainer Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi, their OAS had 2, depending on who you read, some people say 4 operatives in Dallas, Texas, the day JFK was murdered. There are documents talking about people speaking French up on the grassy knoll. Those 2 OAS agents, one was flown out of Dallas that night. The other one was driven by a Dallas police officer to the Mexican border.
The more you study JFK and you realize how many people he pissed off, right? It's not surprising at all that you have the mafia involved. You have the Israelis involved. You have the CIA involved. You have, members of NATO involved who trying to upend Operation Gladio. He pissed a lot of people off.
Yes. And he also was in direct contact with Sukarno over in Indonesia and had already scheduled a visit to see him in January after in 1964. And they knew that if he ever went to see Sukarno and figured out what they were doing, that they would all be in trouble. That meeting was never going to be allowed to happen. And also, a lot of people think General Eisenhower was a great guy. Let me just assure you, he was not. Not only did he oversee the creation of Operation Gladio while he was in Europe, when he becomes president, he's the guy that overthrew Iran. He's the guy that used this organization to overthrow the president in Guatemala. And what was the issue in Guatemala? Bananas. Who owned all of the Guatemalan farmland? You know, that thing that we think is absolutely horrible if China owns our farmland. Well, a U.S. oligarch owned the majority of Guatemalan's farmland, and that was United Fruit. And one of the primary stockholders of United Fruit was the Dulles brothers and the Rockefellers. And so they decided, when the Guatemalan president gets elected, he said that he did not want any foreigners owning farmland. Imagine that. Right. And exactly, the irony of everything that's happening right now just blows my mind. Because what's happening in America today is what not we, you and I, but our government has done on behalf of these oligarchs all over the world. So what do? They planned PB Success, which was the name of the operation to overthrow the Guatemalan president. And that was General Eisenhower. Also, one of the very last things he did was issue a findings, which is what it's called when you order the assassination of a foreign head of state, to kill Patrice Lumumba. They killed Patrice Lumumba 3 days before JFK came into office. JFK was in office for at least 3 weeks before he knew that his CIA was complicit in killing Lumumba. He didn't even know he was dead because they had kidnapped him. And how did they do that? What was the lead up to that? Well, they basically, of course, the Congo had uranium. They were the #1 supplier of uranium. Uranium obviously was very important at the time because of the atomic weapons. And because the Congo had just gotten its independence from being a colony of Belgium for 350 years, Patrice Lumumba, their first prime minister, had said, we do not want Belgium getting rich off of to continue to get rich off of our uranium. We want to deal directly with the United States. He flies to the United States, and the vice president will not meet him, Nixon. Eisenhower will not meet him. So he's stuck going to see the Secretary of State. And he tells the Secretary of State, I'll sell you 100% of our uranium, but I don't want Belgium profiting from it. They told him to pound sand. And he goes back and he says, okay, well, if you're not going to deal with me, I know now that I've made this very clear, and you made it very clear that you don't like my stance on this. The IMF is immediately turned off. The World Bank won't talk to him. So they economically strangle him. And he has only one option to get weapons for what he knows is going to come. The only person that at that point will answer his phone is the Soviet Union. What happens as soon as that phone call is made? They call him a communist. He's not a communist, but because they call him a communist, and Eisenhower, and it started with Truman actually, 10-2, a National Security Action Memorandum says, if you are labeled a communist, we have the right to kill you. And so Eisenhower issues a finding to kill Lumumba.
And JFK didn't know about this?
And we all know that 4 months from the time you're a president-elect until you take office, that you are supposed to be being updated with intelligence briefings of what you're walking into. He knew nothing about it.
Yeah, this Lumumba story we've covered this before on our show, and all of the secrecy around it, and not allowing JFK to be aware of this in the lead up to his presidency. This was carried out. I think there was some speculation that he did know about it, or he was somehow briefed on it, or whatever. But I've not seen anything conclusive on that. So You haven't either, then, right?
I have not seen anything that he was briefed on it. I have seen statements from CIA officers that says he was not.
So that's just one example. We have Guatemala as another example. We have Italy as another example. How many people do you think have been killed? Do we have a number
Millions.
of how many people were millions at the hands
Millions.
of these NATO stay-behind armies?
Not directly. Because of the overthrows of these governments, like in Indonesia, 1 million people ended up dying. We destabilized Cambodia. The Pol Pot coming to power was a direct result of a CIA instigated coup. We had people there training in Cambodia. We had people training in Laos. We had people training in one of the most devastating parts of all of this is how much of our federal government was infected with it. You mentioned earlier USAID. USAID had an office called the Office of Public Safety. The Office of Public Safety is one of those things that once you start researching it, your mind just explodes. They recruited former cops from all over the United States, and they trained them to go into these countries that they were going to destabilize, to train national police forces. This is how they did Mossadegh. After Mossadegh, they had stay-behinds in southern Iran leading up to the overthrow of Mossadegh. I didn't know that until last week. I had never found any trace of stay-behinds in Iran, although I researched Iran extensively until literally last week. There was a military advisory group down there. The CIA was down there. And they also used, after they overthrew Mossadegh, they set up under the guise of USAID, Office of Public Safety, what a weird name, General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., Desert Storm guy's dad.
Yeah.
He created the Sabak. He trained the Sabak under the Office of Public Safety. The Sabak is a terrorist organization that basically kidnapped, tortured, and disappeared people that disagreed with the Shah. You will find the Office of Public Safety in like 50 or 60 different countries around the world. And every one of them was done after the CIA installs a dictator there.
So this Office of Public Safety, is it under, what umbrella is it under?
USAID.
So it's under USAID, and have these recent changes to USAID and the disbanding of it, has that affected?
It cut it off. The Office of Public Safety actually was done away with in 1974 because it came under intense scrutiny by Congress in the 1975, family jewels of the CIA investigations. No one was held accountable. As a matter of fact, when you go back and look, Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, which we know to be basically the same thing, it was torturing, kidnapping, and assassinating anyone that went against the puppet government that had been installed in the South. So Operation Phoenix was ran by the Michigan State University. A lot of people don't know that. Michigan State University hired CIA agents, literal agents, not fronts, not assets, agents. They dressed them up as professors and they deployed them to Vietnam basically to set up the Phoenix program. What I just recently learned is Indiana University, my old alma mater, was working as a partnership with Michigan State in that initiative. And they deployed over to Operation Phoenix under the guise of USAID, Office of Public Safety, and set up this apparatus of training. They set up torture prisons, and you find a guy by the name of Dan Mederone, who I've covered extensively. He was the Richmond police chief in Richmond, Indiana. He was trained by the FBI. He sent his officers to Indiana University's police training, this same training partnership with Michigan State. He was selected as a part of the Office of Public Safety. He was first deployed to Brazil right before their coup. Then you find him in Uruguay with their new military installed dictator there. And he was instrumental in training people how to torture people, how to kidnap people, and much of the torture led to the people dying. And that's just one aspect of it, not the entire of these national police going out and literally bombing people's houses just because they were suspected as resisting the military dictatorship that we had installed there. And so again, tens of thousands in every single one of these operations. They were in Argentina. Argentina took their prisoners because they didn't want to dig the graves, loaded them up on aircraft and flew them out over the ocean and dumped them out. So it's almost impossible to get a body count of the number of people that have been affected by these programs.
We talked about Operation Northwoods, which is really an extension of Operation Gladio. Has there been any other on domestic U.S. soil that we know of that would fall under the Operation Gladio umbrella? False flag attacks on the United States. I mean, other than 9/11.
On the United States, we had Gladio operators that killed the Chilean ambassador that got stuck here. He was here, and he couldn't go back because of the assassination of President Allende in Chile. Ambassador Lettier is his name. One of the Cuban exiles, I think two went to prison. They were trained Gladio people, went to Washington, D.C. and ignited a car bomb, killing him and an American citizen, his aide, in downtown Washington, D.C. They were also implicated in the overthrow of Nixon. They were implicated in the assassination of JFK and RFK. When he was assassinated, if you trace the people that really did it, not Sirhan, they were tied to the Cuban exiles and the CIA.
And MK Ultra, mind control. I mean, so I've done deep dives on MK Ultra, of course, the CIA's secret mind control brainwashing program to carry out nefarious things. Are there any blending here across Operation Gladio and MK Ultra?
I'm glad you asked that question. Do you know who Jim Jones is?
Sure.
Okay. Do you know where Jim Jones' hometown was?
San Francisco, right?
Richmond, Indiana.
Oh, right. But he okay. Then when he really started getting going and building his
Correct.
church, was
he moved his
San
church to San Francisco. Jim Jones was classmates with Dan Miterone, the guy I just talked about.
Wow. Come on.
I'm not even kidding.
I give up. I swear to God. I mean, I just try to go through my days as like a normal human being, and all of these pieces, it's just unbelievable to me on a regular basis. You're blowing my mind.
Okay. So Jim Jones moves his church out to San Francisco. He is almost immediately approved as a foster home in San Francisco.
Right.
If you go back and you do the research, you find out that the mayor of San Francisco kills himself because he was one of the purveyors of the children in Jim Jones' little compound. Jim Jones was part of the Democrat vote running that was going on both in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He was intimately involved in all kinds of nefarious things. What I didn't know when I started looking into Jim Jones, but I don't have any concrete evidence that while in San Francisco, he was part of MK Ultra. I do have evidence of him being involved when he relocated to Guyana. Why did he relocate to Guyana? The reason he did is because Congressman Leo Ryan, the only active congressional member to ever be assassinated on duty, began an investigation into Jim Jones and the CIA in the operation that they were running out in San Francisco. And so Jim Jones, because the pressure is getting to him, he relocates his commune to Jonestown. Well, I had already came across evidence that Jonestown existed long before Jim Jones moved his church there. And it was used as a terrorist training camp for Operation Condor in Latin America. So he had ships. He was going from Brazil to Guyana with weapons. They were using them against Venezuela in order to protect who? Rockefeller's oil interest in Venezuela. So anybody in Venezuela that became a problem was taken out, launched from Jim Jones, Jonestown in Guyana. So all these people show up, and if you go back and you read the autopsy of the local Guyanan coroner, you find out that none of those people were poisoned with cyanide. They all had injection sites at the base of their neck. If you read Colonel Purdy's book, you find out that the body bags for those people were ordered the day before the massacre even happened to the Joint Chiefs of Staff to fly the body bags in. And despite having flown the body bags in, they were left out for 2 weeks, so no one could see any of the evidence because it was 100 and some degrees there, and their bodies began to decomposing. And so a person that had been working for Jim Jones before all of the massacre happened had said that they were a whistleblower and got Leo Ryan to fly to Guyana because they were going to reveal all of the nefarious things that he had alleged already. And he's assassinated when he lands on the tarmac.
So cyanide was not used. I mean, we had like over 300 children given drink, heard like the Flavor Aid or whatever that they were all drinking. It was not Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid.
Right.
So
none of that happened.
You're blowing my mind. None of that happened. They had injections. And of course, yeah, you're right. They were left out. We have the visuals. We have the images of I think it was like the famous Newsweek cover, right? The aerial photographs from high up where you see them out in the sun. They've been sitting out. The bodies have been rotting in the sun for weeks.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
So go ahead.
No, I don't even know what to ask. I'm just blown away. You're blowing my mind. I'm just, I'll let you run with it. I mean, put the pieces together for me because I'm just.
So the part we haven't talked about is how they get the money to do all of this, because it was all done covertly off the books. How they get the money. Right. Also, at the end of World War II, you had a civil war going on in China. You had Mao fighting against Chiang Kai-shek and other warlords in the South. Well,
the nationalists,
Colonel Paul Helliwell was one of the OSS officers, somehow also in the military. I've come across a lot of that happening, by the way. But Colonel Paul Helliwell was a military attaché to Chiang Kai-shek during World War II. And he's watching Chiang Kai-shek pay for his military efforts against Mao by selling opium. Now, there's a long story of Indian opium flooding China at this time under the auspices of the British Empire, who basically owned India at the time, the Boxer Wars, all of that stuff. So Chiang had a model of funding his revolution with drug money. So Paul Helliwell picks up the phone and he says, "Hey, Alan Dulles, I got a great way to pay for that Operation Gladio thing that you're kicking off. And we could do it with drug money. It's untraceable. It's cash. Let's do that." And so they make a deal with Chiang Kai-shek that they're going to supply him military aid to fight Mao under the guise of anti-communism. And Chiang Kai-shek gets kicked out of China eventually. They move him to Burma. So Chiang Kai-shek sets up his opium operation out of Burma. The Burmese government eventually kicks him out. So there's this tiny little island over here called Formosa. We now call it Taiwan. But Formosa at the time had been a Japanese island occupied. It's a Chinese island. It was occupied during World War II by the Japanese. And so under the guise of going on to Formosa to get the rest of the Japanese out, there are US people present there. Well, they move Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT army of drug smugglers over to Formosa. And if you go through the first several, and I just pulled out of my notes, the first several State Department, they weren't ambassadors at the time, that was in Taiwan, and the first several CIA chiefs, you find them also involved in other Operation Gladio destabilization efforts. So, for example, the first station chief in 1949 assigned to Formosa, now called Taiwan, was Raymond Pierce. He was an OSS veteran who had parachuted to set up the KMT in Burma. He also was part of the Western Enterprise, Inc., which was a CIA front company headquartered in Taiwan that arranged arms to go into Formosa, but not officially. It was black market arms. He also moved on to work with radio nets, opium finance, weapon drops, and other activity, because I didn't know until I started doing this research that Taiwan wasn't just one island, it's 7. And the KMT was set up on all of those islands to launch after World War II and after they kicked Chiang Kai-shek out, to launch military operations into China to destabilize it. We also, one of the former ambassadors was involved in the destabilization of Tibet. And again, until I did this research, I didn't know that we had an entire contingent of stay-behind units in Tibet. So what we did was we took Tibetans, we flew them into Colorado to an abandoned World War II base, taught them how to be terrorists, and then took them back out to Tibet for them to launch attacks internal to China as well. We did the same thing with the Uyghurs, by the way. We used Nepal for that. We took Uyghurs out of China, trained them to be terrorists in Nepal. So
all in an effort to destabilize China.
Yes. So Taiwan now is the drug hub. So Chiang Kai-shek, he immediately implements martial law for the next 40 years. Taiwan, up until Richard Nixon actually recognizes China going into the early 80s, Taiwan was under a dictatorship, under martial law. They were not a democracy at all. Chiang Kai-shek, his son, and one other guy were the rulers, the dictators in Taiwan. So it is not a coincidence that in the immediate aftermath of having to recognize mainland China, and we can no longer call Taiwan the Republic of China because they're not, that Intel, another one of those oligarchical companies, decided Taiwan is going to be where we put all of our semiconductors, because we have to have an excuse to defend Taiwan. And we just lost it when they recognized Taiwan, or recognized mainland China. So now we have another excuse. But you can't overstate the importance of this drug network that was ran out of the Golden Triangle with Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and that entire region, because they use the Vatican Bank to money launder all of the drug money. And that's another reason why Italy was critical to the exposure of Operation Gladio. The P2 Masonic Lodge was set up. Lucio Gelli was the guy that was running the P2 Lodge. That's how they met. They met under the guise of this Masonic Lodge. There was like 800 names eventually released that belonged to this P2 Masonic Lodge. And according to Vatican rules, you're not even allowed to be a Mason and be a Catholic. So how were all of these Catholics belonging to the Masonic Lodge? P2 also shows up in Operation Condor. Their subsidiary was in Argentina. And that's how they were able to coordinate. And it's not coincidental that when we lost the Golden Triangle, we moved to Afghanistan. That's when we went in the 1980s, because of course in the 70s we lost basically the control of Asia's drug market. So we go to Afghanistan, there's opium there. It's not a coincidence that in the year 2000, the Taliban had eradicated almost all of the opium. And the next year we have 9/11, and immediately we go back into Afghanistan because bin Laden just so happens to be in Afghanistan. And what happens to the opium production? It skyrockets right back. And Operation Condor created the ability, the control mechanisms to move a lot of the drug apparatus to Latin America. That's why Colombia has been so important to the drug networking into the United States. So they set up all kinds of banks, the Bank of Commerce, Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, Castle Bank. Paul Helliwell actually set that bank up in the Caribbean. And Nugent Hand was set up in Australia. Those banks, in conjunction with the Vatican, was the money laundering apparatus to facilitate this entire network.
Do you think anyone in the Trump administration is as fully versed on this as you and is actively trying to eradicate this? Or is deep state forces so entrenched that this is perpetuating at a much larger level than even we knew about in the 1940s and 50s?
So I have to believe if they don't know all of what I know, they know a lot of what I know, because they wouldn't have gone after USAID the way they did. Because a lot of the the facilitation of this has moved into USAID. USAID is a CIA front. Mm-hmm. The interaction between those two, both in personnel and in mission, is intrinsically linked.
How so?
Well, for example, the Office of Public Safety. I'm reviewing a book right now called Hidden Terrors by A.J. Landguth. That book illustrates that the Office of Public Safety actually had CIA agents working in it. And that's under USAID. That is just one. The Office of Transition Initiatives is another one that had CIA embedded in it. It functions as a CIA front.
How much of this is still left? Because we know some of it has been rolled into the State Department under Marco Rubio. A lot of it has been cut off, these people packing their boxes up and leaving. But how much of do you think this operation might have been rolled into the State Department, which in many ways is as equally nefarious as the CIA?
Well, as my research has shown, ambassador after ambassador, they specifically move particular ambassadors to locations that they are going to destabilize with CIA and USAID operations. You find the same ambassadors showing up all the time. One of the most intriguing guys that I ran across that I had never heard about before was William Pauly. William Pauly was supposedly this multi-millionaire businessman living in South Florida. Pauly Island in South Carolina is actually named after his family, the very wealthy family. And he ends up becoming an ambassador. He was the Assistant Secretary of State at one point. Him and Paul Helliwell were very good friends. And he owned the franchise of Curtiss Aircraft in Southeast Asia. So he's the guy that literally gave Chiang Kai-shek all of his aircraft. They set up Sea Supply together to give him a navy. And he owned the bus system and several large sugar plantations in Cuba. He used his personal yacht to take a group of Cuban exiles to Cuba for a land invasion. He's an ambassador out of the State Department. He also worked on the Guatemalan coup with a guy by the name of Tommy the Cork Corcoran, who is CIA. He also was an executive at Pan Am, and Pan Am was oftentimes used for cargo shipments for the CIA. So when you start researching these people, they go in and out of the oligarch class into the State Department and back in order to ensure their vested interests are what we're after and not the interest of the United States as a country.
Right. Oh,
But
clearly.
yeah, he's fascinated. He's mentioned in a book called The Legacy of Ashes.
Mhm.
He literally went to a bank and pulled out $150,000 after meeting with President Eisenhower to buy 3 planes for the Guatemalan coup.
It's funny. I've interviewed Tim Weiner on that book. It came out years ago. Back when I was still working at Fox News at the time, I interviewed him about that. Yeah, his book Legacy of Ashes, and I read that years ago. You're just refreshing my memory. It's been a number of years now, but it's remarkable. Um, and you see it in the United States, even in the book like Chaos, about the history of the CIA in the 1960s in California, and of course the infiltration of the CIA and all of these groups, infiltrating the hippie movement in Berkeley.
Yes.
It's all happening right on the United States soil. It's hard for Americans to believe it, right?
It was certainly, having spent 30 years in the military, hard for me to believe that all of this stuff happened and I was completely ignorant of all of it. And again, I'm educated. So I thought,
Yeah.
you are educated in what they want you to know. And if you start using internet search engines that pick up foreign news articles and things like that. Now, again, one of the things I have not told you is in 1990, when Italy first exposed Operation Gladio, I know the date because Paul Williams' book called Operation Gladio, and I've interviewed him a couple of times on my podcast, stuck out to me like a sore thumb because the 2nd of August, 1990 is the very day I arrived at the Rome airport for my 3-year assignment in Italy. So I'm reading his book a couple of years ago, and I'm like, 2 August 1990. What I noticed about Italy in the 3 years that I lived there during this exposure operation, they were gunning down judges that were hearing cases about Operation Gladio. They were killing prosecutors. They were killing reporters. And I just thought that there was a crap ton of mafia in Italy. I never heard the words Operation Gladio. They called it Years of Lead. And I didn't know anything about what was going on. I didn't know it was all part of this. I didn't speak Italian, but I heard my landlord and their daughters talking about it who spoke English. And I never put 2 and 2 together. What I also realized is if you are behind Operation Gladio and you know it's being ran out of NATO. So he reveals this in August, and all of the other NATO countries go, we don't have anything like that. That must have been just something Italy did. Well, October was a NATO planning meeting for Operation Gladio. There was 2 cells in NATO. One was called the Allied Clandestine Planning. The other one was called CPC. And one of them had a meeting in October. So Andreotti, the prime minister that exposed it in August, comes back on television in November of 1990 and said, hey, all you guys that said you didn't have anything to do with Operation Gladio, here's the list of the countries that had just attended the planning meeting. He told on all of them. And so, again, what I remember about the 2nd of August is getting off the aircraft at the international terminal and going into the airport. Now, it's my first time overseas as a military officer. And I am greeted, for every person that was in the Rome airport that day, there's about 20 carabinieri with AK-47s. And I'm like, what the heck did I just do? I had no idea that international airports were so militarized. What the heck is going on? That was the exact same day that Saddam Hussein had been given State Department authority to invade Kuwait. And do you know what the convenient thing that all of the NATO countries said after the 2nd of August, 1990, as to why they couldn't answer any questions about Operation Gladio? We got to go to war.
We're too
We're
busy.
planning a war.
We're too busy to answer questions about something. It's a Cold War relic. We can't talk about it, even though it was still happening. That's amazing
Correct.
to me that, well, and it's convenient that Italy could use, these are just mafia hits. So don't look any more deeply into this. We're killing prosecutors. So the prosecutors that were killed, the judges that were killed, they were hearing cases about Operation Gladio.
Yes. Yes.
And what were the prosecutors zeroing in on? Who were they going after that led them to be shot and killed?
Well, understand that Prime Minister Andreotti eventually goes to jail. It went to the very top of Italy. It involved the Vatican. It involved Lucio Gelli, the guy that was the P2 Masonic Grand Poobah, whatever you call him. The bankers, Calvi, the guy that gets strung up on a bridge in London. The bank Ambrosiano was, the Vatican had so much money that they were laundering, they couldn't do it by themselves. So they involved Italian banks. The chief of the military intelligence, the chief of the military, basically their SecDef, they were all involved in it.
Carrying out these operations.
Yes. The train bombing, the bank bombings, all of them.
The Bologna massacre, all of it.
Yes.
Tied to
the
them.
Attempted assassination on John Paul II was 2 Grey Wolf Gladio people from Turkey. That's who eventually went to jail for that attempted assassination. They were part of Operation Gladio.
Since you've already blown my mind enough, talking about Jonestown and all of these connections here, and I think about like the USS Liberty false flag.
Yes.
Under Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, all the way up to the Mossad and the CIA working hand in hand there, get us involved in a war in Egypt, of course. Operation Gladio involvement in any of that? Wouldn't be surprised. You'll probably...
The same pattern is involved in all of them. So one of the things that I've found out is like Iran-Contra. If you understand Operation Gladio and you go back and you start reviewing the attempted overthrow of the Nicaraguan government under the same auspices that we don't want them to have their own farmland, they were primarily owned by United Fruit as well. The Sandinistas finally get in power. There's a lot of people that don't like the Sandinistas, whatever. That was the government that got elected. So we began funding covertly, using these covert same funds to fund the Contras. Reagan, with George Bush as his vice president, starts using Israel as a weapons cutout. So they become a major weapons trafficker. The U.S. is
into Nicaragua. So we can sort of
into Iran
wash our hands.
And then Nicaragua. So
right.
Yeah. So Israel gives,
but we could wash our hands
Iran.
of it then. We could sort of, we're funneling it through Israel, so it's not really going to Nicaragua. Yeah, exactly.
Correct. And the same thing happened in Angola under Reagan. So we do not want the government that Angola is going to put in place. Angola backs up to the uranium, the gold, the diamonds. So we want to control Angola for the oligarchs. So we get cut off. The CIA gets cut off from funding Angola directly. So what do? They use Israel to funnel weapons into South Africa, which at the time was apartheid South Africa, and they're running them over the border into Angola to fight this. Cuban exiles from the CIA-trained Cuban exile farm down in Miami are in Angola fighting. They were part of the, I told you about Felix Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez was training the Contras. So all of this, Israel has been an integral part of all of this. As a matter of fact, we didn't even mention that Taiwan set up a thing called the Political Warfare Cadre Academy. The gist of it, it's a terrorist training camp. The gist of it was, though, that all of these national police organizations and these death squads that we were setting up covertly in Latin America, all they had to do was call themselves a political party And in the US press, we'll just say if you attack the death squads that you're attacking democracy. I would argue a lot of the Democrat parties like that today in America, but it literally was a curriculum set up at a academy in Taiwan to teach these people. And if you go back and just do a search of how many of the School of Americas, which was set up in Panama, it eventually moves to Fort Benning, were graduates. They all end up in the National Police Force in Latin America. How many of those people ended up in the Political Warfare Academy? A crap ton of them did. And if you go and look at the countries that still have political ties to Taiwan officially, the majority of them are all in Latin America because of that. And so again, it just keeps, it's an onion, and the more you unpeel, the bigger you understand this operation has like enveloped the entire world, cross continents, cross regional hemispheres, and it was held together through this post-World War II intelligence network.
So I guess I'll get you out of here on this. I could spend all afternoon talking about it, but how much of this is still in operation today?
I don't have any way of knowing that. What I look for today is patterns based on their past operations. I would say all of the 2020 Summer of Love was part of this operation. It is exactly the election interference in 2016, all directly ties to the CIA and the model that they set up when they destabilized Chile during Linde's initial presidential run and then afterwards. So there are patterns of it happening in the United States. The infiltration of all of these illegal aliens into the United States, it provides the perfect cover, whether or not, and we know a lot of them are criminals, but whether or not they're actually Gladio cells doesn't matter, because they will be blamed for it and the real Gladio cells will not. So do I believe that they were up to nefarious things? Absolutely, because this is a very similar pattern to destabilization of other countries.
Well, Colonel, you've blown my mind on all of this. Where can people learn more about your work, research, in all of this? Again, I'd love to have you back. We can do more deep dives on this, but I think this was a good primer for people to understand Operation Gladio.
So primarily, if you go to my X account, one of my researchers, assistants, Bridget, has created a pinned post that has, I do a 4 o'clock show where we read, we do book reviews on X in Spaces every day. I'm at Colonel spelled out Towner on X, TOWNER. And that pinned post has links to everything. The Rumble channel, my interviews with Paul Williams are over there, the guy that wrote Operation Gladio, the book. And my Rumble channel is called The Colonel's Corner. And there are hundreds of hours of research. I also do a Wednesday night show with Alpha Warrior. It's called the Alpha Warrior Show on Rumble. And we started at a primer to Operation Gladio over a year ago. And every Wednesday night at 9:30, we have a show. I just did the deep dive into Obama and the family CIA ties to not just his mom and dad, but his grandmother and grandfather in a 2-part series there. So I'm all about the CIA at this point.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we'll link it up in the description below, and so people can look and follow your work. Colonel, great to have you here on the show. Thank you for this. Thank you for your incredible research and sharing it with our audience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm honored.